and how that impacts our Jewish communities today as well. So that's kind of the starting point. And the history, some of this will be review for many of you. And if there's questions, feel free either to come off mic, or I don't know how you've been setting this up with the college kids that I've been giving. They just interrupt. And I'm okay with that too. If there's something pressing, or you can put something in the chat box on the right side of the screen there. Excuse me. And so that's basically the beginning. Let's start from the beginning of Chassidus, at least. We have the Jewish community as we know it, and what is going on is a division amongst the people. You have an evolution of like the Jewish Intelligencia. This Jewish Intelligencia is we're the rabbis, we're the scholars, we possess the knowledge, which also, especially in its time, meant that they possessed a lot of the wealth, whether it was them or their parents-in-law, that enabled them to sit and study all day, where everyone else had to go to work, in whatever field, blacksmithing or peddling or whatever it would be to pay the bills, not unlike today. And this class, if you will, of rabbis evolves, and then you have the populace, the general people, which I always love when you read the literature and it talks about the uneducated masses, and they only knew all of Mishnayos by heart, and they only knew all of Sefer Tehillim by heart, and they only knew, these were the uneducated masses. But nonetheless, that's what they were considered at the time. And coinciding in the same time period, you have this group of what they call the hidden mystics. And these hidden mystics, many of them use the name of the Baal Shem, right? We've heard of the Baal Shem Tov, of course. There are many, or not many, but numerous Baal Shems that lived throughout the world. And in fact, just a bit of unique, Jewish trivia. The picture of the Baal Shem Tov that we all see is known to actually not be the Baal Shem Tov. It was the Baal Shem of London, if I remember correctly. So when we see that picture, it's not actually him. But there was this movement of these Baal Shems, which is the master of the name, as we know Baal Shem translates to. And they were all functioning independently of one another. I mean, the Baal Shem Tov, as we know, is in Russia, and Baal Shem of London, as the name implies, is obviously in London, and numerous others around Europe and the Pale of Settlement over there, Poland, Russia, things like this. And they are hidden mystics. They would spend time deep in contemplation and meditation and study, obviously, of general Torah, and then also the more esoteric teachings of Torah. And within that, they also would practice for themselves self-refinement out of spirituality. Things like asceticism, sometimes to the extreme. They would go out rolling in snow. They would sleep on benches. They would only eat the crust of black bread, excluding Shabbos, where they would eat slightly better bread, I guess. It's oftentimes how it would be written. But they would indulge a little bit more on Shabbos for the sanctity of Shabbos. But the whole point of this asceticism was to strip away the physicality in order to focus on the spirituality. And we're certainly not going to really go into the advantages and disadvantages of asceticism, but just one parenthetical piece. Many people would ask the Rebbe about asceticism and if we in our generation should be practicing asceticism. And the Rebbe said the avodah of our generation, the practice of our generation, should be simcha and not asceticism. And as time goes on, from when Rebbe spoke those words on several occasions, and especially in our trying times, as much as sometimes we want to ignore it at the moment, but we have to acknowledge the time that we're in, especially at our times, simcha is the main avodah. And when we're approaching challenge and we're approaching difficulty. And we see even without coronavirus and whatnot, simcha is a true challenge to achieve. So the Rebbe's wise words of that's the avoid of our generation. But traveling back in time, and we're talking early 1700s here. I neglected to give you a time period. Traveling back in time to the Baal Shem Tov and his cadre of peers, they would be practicing ascetics and deep in meditation and contemplation of the divine. And it was a deeply emotional experience. So we see this divide between the intelligentsia, as I mentioned before, and this emotional approach to Hashem. And eventually, the Baal Shem Tov in particular, Yisrael ben Eliezer, as he's known by name, the Baal Shem Tov would travel from village to village, as would all of these other Baal Shems, not in a coordinated effort. And they would often travel in an effort to stay hidden. But eventually, over time, they realized that they needed to expose who they are. And then they start revealing themselves as these mystics, and each one in their own way. And it comes to a head with this intelligentsia. And the Baal Shem Tov, and there's not very good documentation, at least that I've seen, of how he ascends to this leadership, or the spokesman, if you will, of these mystics. But essentially, he says, Torah was given at Mount Sinai for the entirety of Judaism, for the entirety of Jewry, all Jews received the Torah. It wasn't just given to the scholars. It wasn't just given to the rabbis. It wasn't just given to the wealthy. It was given to all of the Jewish people. And true, the scholars might have the time, the ability, intellectual ability, financial ability to be able to sit and study, but all Jews have a right to connect with Hashem, to connect with the one above. And effectively, the Baal Shem Tov starts teaching through preaching, right? Through telling stories. For the quote-unquote simpleton, again, that simpleton is the one who only knew all of Mishnayos and all of Tehillim and so on and so forth, but also the simpleton who wasn't exposed to these types of things, and would teach through parable, would teach through story, would teach through little life lessons, and would also teach through an emotional and sometimes ecstatic emotional experience. And the Baal Shem Tov over time really comes to a head with this what I've called the intelligentsia. And this intelligentsia, interestingly, fascinatingly, and I cannot understand why, start naming these factions, and they tongue-in-cheek call the Hasidim the Hasidim. So we know Chassid is a pious one. So it was almost like, oh, look who thinks so pious now. That's how the name Chassidim actually comes about. And this is the part that I can't figure out. They call themselves the Misnagdim. They call themselves the opponents, right? If it were me and I were making a movement, I would call myself the Chassid, and I would call the other people the opponents. But nonetheless, this is how it worked. And they call themselves, again, the Misnagdim. And they are arguing for a hyper intellectual approach to the divine. It's all about halacha. It's all about Shulchan Aruch, which is a relatively fresh publication in this time period. And it's all about halacha. It's all about understanding the Gemaras. It's all about understanding the nuances of Torah. And the rabbinic edict is. And the Baal Shem Tov and his school of thought is much more diverse than that. Is much more democratic, for lack of a better word, giving everybody at least an approach. It does not, and this is very important to recognize, it does not negate the importance of halacha. it absolutely is Hasidism is absolutely a halachic movement, as we all know, but shines a light on a much deeper element. And this is my own language, of course, but halacha gives a very strong how. This is how we do things, right? We're approaching Pesach now, and we're all getting our email boxes filled with all the Hilchos Pesach and all of the Q&As. I think one happened yesterday, if I remember right, with Rabbi Elkan, of Hilchos Pesach. And it's very important to how. And what Chassidus really comes to illuminate, which of course always existed in Torah, is the why. Why are these mitzvahs? How do they help us connect to the one above? And that's what the Baal Shem Tov comes to bring into the foreground. And that's, again, through storytelling, through a in addition to the intellect, but through an emotional connection. So this is the Baal Shem Tov's life spans from 1698 till 1760. And in his lifetime, he gets a group of followers of these other mystics. The most notable would be his successor in leadership in what we call the Chassidic movement. So we often call the Baal Shem Tov the grandfather of Chassidus. He was the proto-Chassid. He existed from the beginning. And we have the Maggid of Mezrich. Maggid of Mezrich, actually not much younger than the Baal Shem Tov himself, lives from 1710 till 1772. And the Maggid, excuse me, Doivber from Ben Avram, if I remember correctly, is the from the town of Mezrich, actually a direct descendant of David HaMelech, of King David. He is attracted to the teachings of Baal Shem Tov, and he succeeds the Baal Shem Tov in this teaching and having these Hasidic, or the term Hasidic kind of emerges now, again with the Chassidim and the Misnagdim, but of these mystics. And you have the Maggid has a wild table, if you could imagine. His inner circle, which they call the Chevrai Kadisha, the Holy Society, sits around his table. And just like now, when I give a class, or Rabbi Friedman gives a class, especially in something esoteric, everybody that sits around the table will hear the exact same information, and they will synthesize it in their own way. And this Chevrai Kadisha of these students, if you will, are sitting, and they each are understanding the teachings of the Maggid just slightly differently, or connecting to slightly different elements of the teachings of the Maggid. The Maggid his leadership was relatively short from when the Baal Shem Tov passes away until he passes away is only 12 years. And in that 12-year time, this group of Chevrai Kadisha becomes a very strong unit of mystics, we'd call them today, Kabbalists, and spending their time deep in study, deep in learning with the Maggid and with each other, and in deep ecstatic prayer. Some of them really screaming in prayer, getting very excited, each in their own way. And these are the masters that we know their names today. Meaning like this: you have the Karliner Rebbe, Aaron of Karlin, you have the Chernobyler, you have the Ruzhiner. These are the people that are sitting at the table of the Maggid. So by and large today, I don't always cite Wikipedia as the greatest source for all Jewish knowledge, but if you go to the Wikipedia entry on Hasidism, and I actually do recommend you do it, there's some 250 Hasidic groups that exist today. Each of them essentially can trace their lineage back to one of the people sitting at the table of the Maggid. And again, you have split-offs as different dynasties, as Rebbes have sons who become Rebbes, but they all come back into these 22 original students sitting by the Maggid's table. And when the Maggid passes away, the oldest student, as it makes sense and was the custom in a certain sense, becomes the leader, Mendel Haradaker. Mendel Haradaker was a very interesting choice as a leader, though. He was the oldest student of the Maggid, but he moved. He wasn't living in Russia anymore with the rest of them. He had moved to Jerusalem. He's living in then Palestine. And this was pre-Zoom and pre-WhatsApp and pre-email, which makes things not perfect, but a heck of a lot easier to connect with each other, as we're doing right now. And it's very hard to teach and lead a group of students when it could take weeks or more for a teaching or a letter or something to make its way back to the Chavrai Kadisha. So the Mendel Haradoker actually appoints a new leader from the Chevra, and it was actually the youngest student of the group, and his name was Shner Zalman of Liadi. Now, for those of us familiar with Chabad, that's a very familiar name. We call him the Alter Rebbe. So we just had the youngest guy, and we call him the old rabbi, as the term Alter Rebbe translates. But right, so meaning he was the first Chabad Rebbe, and we'll get there in a second. We're going to go into the split of dynasties momentarily. But the reason, just to revisit a term that I used a moment ago, we said that we call the Baal Shem Tov the grandfather of Chassidus, which means that the Magid is the father of Chassidus. And then all of these Chevrai Kadisha become the beginnings of their own dynasties, as I mentioned before, as we know them today, and all of their offshoots. So the Alter Rebbe becomes the head, the founder of the Chabad movement, the Ruzhiner of the Ruzhiner, right? Some other names that we might be very familiar with is Reb Eli Melech of Lizhansk, Reb Zusha of Anapoli, his brother. These were the Chevrai Kadisha. These were the holy people sitting around the table of the Magid. And upon the Alter Rebbe, or Shner Zalman's appointment to leadership, one of the things that he tells his cohort, if you will, is we need to go back home. We need to go back home and teach Chassidus. So they go back to all of their various towns, villages, shtetelach that they come from, right? Like I named all the cities before, Karlin and Ruzhin and so on and so forth. And they go back there and they start teaching Chassidus, the teachings of the Magid and of the Baal Shem Tov, with their own flavor. And that's how Chassidus effectively evolves. So that's a good pausing point if there's some questions on clarity of things that I've said up until now. So if anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself. If you're on a laptop and not a phone, if you hit spacebar and hold it down while you talk, it will just temporarily unmute you as well. Okay. Take that to mean there's no. I can't see most of your face.
No, but we're listening.
Okay, no problem. I take that to mean there's no questions yet. So they've all gone home, and they're teaching Chassidus, and they're growing, and they're each growing their own dynasties in their own ways, and some of them maintain some of this ascetic practice. Until today, there are certain Hasidic groups that are more ascetic than others. And some interweave in and out of different practices at different times. What is fascinating is most of these Rebbes, after the first generation, don't have a ton of what we'll call theological writings. And the Alter Rebbe, as we well know, does, right? In Tanya and in Likutei Torah and Torah and other Maimarim, other Hasidic discourses of the Alter Rebbe. And so Tanya is basically universally used as we will call, it's often called Torah Shebeksav, the written Torah of Hasidus. And you see other Hasidic movements, whatever they might be, that will reference and use Tanya as their launching point for whatever theology that they bring to the table as well. And again, that's not to say, God forbid, that these Rebbes are not teaching Torah and things like that, but what they use as a launching and you'll see and Divrei Torah and Pilpulim and Chidushim from these other Rebbes, but not Maimorim in the same fashion as Chabad. And Chabad, as many of us are familiar, is a standalone in theology than the rest of the Hasidic groups. So we have Chabad, and we know Chabad is an acronym for three things, right? Chochmah, Bina, and Das, which are the three intellectual faculties of the soul, as explained in Kabbalah and Tanya. It's a certain intellectual approach to the divine. And the other Hasidic groups will self-identify as what they call Chagas Chasidim. Chagas Chasidim is Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, which are the three primary emotional faculties of the soul, which is, again, reflective of a certain approach that they take to the divine, where, like, if you look at, like, the Karliner Chasidim, some of you, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, maybe have experienced Karliner Chasidim, that in the middle of davening will be clapping their hands and screaming as loud as possible. It's quite fantastic to watch, and it's a very radically different approach to davening that we in Chabad will often take. Again, of course, Chabad has an emotional component through Nigunim and Simcha and all of these other things, but how we try to relate to the divine, how we try to relate to Hashem, is through a certain intellectual connection. So that's the first piece there to think about. And there is connection between all of these Rebbes as they go home, of course, albeit in a different way, not being in the same geographic location. And each Hasidic community develops in its own right. Some having split off right away as the beginnings, as Rebbes would pass away, and others holding on to leadership quite strongly. In Chabad, you really don't see much variance from the main tree. At one point, you had one Rebbe had multiple sons that kind of went off, and then it comes back into Lubavitch as we know it today. And that's why Lubavitch and Chabad are synonymous. So I'm going to fast forward through some history because there's kind of this amalgamation of Hasidism that's happening in Europe. And just to point out a few highlights, the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, creates a first innovation, or another innovation, I shouldn't say a first innovation, another innovation of the Hasidic world in creating a yeshiva. Up until this point, you learned in whatever yeshivas were nearby to you. Or if you had a good head, you'd get to go to Harvard, and you'd go to the fine yeshivas. You'd go to Volozhin, you'd go to Vilna, you'd go to Minsk, you'd go to these big seats of Torah, and you'd sit and learn in their yeshivas. But there was not a Hasidically oriented yeshiva. And the Rebbe Rashab, the Rabbi Shlomo Elkan, the fifth Rebbe, so I just jumped 4 Rebbes on you, but he opens up Tomchei Temimim, Lubavitch, the very first Hasidic yeshiva. And so one of the most profound innovations of that yeshiva, I don't know how many of you learned in Lubavitch yeshivas or learned in other yeshivas, but the most profound innovation, aside from, of course, all of the actual learning that happens there, is up until that point in yeshivas, chavrusas, study partners, would sit next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. And it became a standard in Tomchei Temimim that you sit opposite your chavrus. And that was done for 2 reasons. But one, the Rebbe Rashab felt that it was very important, panim al panim. When you're face to face, it creates an intimacy. And the intimacy says, right, finding a good chavrusa is more difficult than finding your life partner, finding your wife. So it's having that intimate relationship over intellectual learning is really important. And that was the first reason. The second reason is the advent of the printing press, or the proliferation of the printing press, I should say. It already had been invented for quite some time, but all of a sudden books were a bit more available than certainly than they are today. Now they're more available, but then they were more available than from the origins. So if you were sitting next to your chavrusa, you could share a text. So this was an innovation of Tomchei Temimim Lubavitch, whereas today, in many yeshivas, Hasidic or otherwise, chavrusas will sit opposite each other. And just to give a frame of reference, in Volozhin, I heard this from Rabbi Beryl Wine, whose father learned in Volozhin. Nowadays, if you think about your own bookshelves, right? How many sets of shas do we maybe have in our own home? Or how many sets of Likutei Torah or Likutei Sichas or whatever, how many different sets? And if we don't have it, it's available online, especially right now, right? Lots of these online archives made everything available for free. And it's just there. It's available for the taking. But the yeshivas would not even have a full set of shas. So in Volozhin and many other yeshivas, the way it would work is certain bachrim would be tapped, and they were sent to the wealthy man of the community who owned the shas, who owned the set of Talmud, and he would learn the entire tractate, the entire Masechta Baal Peh, or at least a good chunk. They'd split it up maybe, and he would memorize it. And then when the other bachrim in the yeshiva were learning, and they got to a point and it quoted another Gemara, they would walk over to this guy and say, what does it say on Masechah Shabbos Daf Lamed Amud Beis? And he would quote it over to them from memory. And that's how they would know what was in the other Masechta, whereas today we just look it up on our phone, right? Or go over to the bookshelf at the very least and find these things. So, and the Bachram would be known by the Masechta that they'd memorized. So, Tomchei Temimim, there's time has moved forward, so they're able to have a little bit more access to text, which creates this innovation of sitting opposite each other, where they get to connect on a deeper level. One of the first radical changes in the yeshiva setting, and that translates. There were many branches of Tomchei Temimim that opened up throughout Europe in its time. Some open, some closed. Depending on the political situation and financial situations, which were often tied together. But there were numerous branches of Tomchei Temimim, ultimately, obviously, moving to New York and to Israel and Montreal and all of the other places that we know these yeshivas to exist today. But the custom of sitting opposite each other has maintained not only in Chabad and Hasidic yeshivas, but is proliferated to much of the Torah world as well. That's another piece. And then I'm going to jump forward again in time. Interestingly, from the Rebbe Rashab to his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they were often in contact with many of the other Rebbes. Again, they needed to be, in terms of askanos, in terms of activism on behalf of the Jewish people. They would be traveling to places like Rostov and Moscow and these places to advocate for Jews, and they would be rubbing elbow to elbow with other Rebbes. And some of them, like the Frierdiker Rebbe in particular, took on a lot of the customs of these other Rebbes, or maintained customs of these other Rebbes as well. And we see a radical shift from that as we move into the Rebbe in the mid 20th century. So what I want to do is jump us to the 20th century and World War II and what that brings about. Obviously, it was an earthquake that shook the entire Jewish world and physically moves the seat of Hasidism out of Russia, out of Poland, and out of Hungary, and moves it to the streets of Brooklyn, primarily. The Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe of Lubavitch, was the first, let's call it Big Rebbe, that comes to America. There were others, but by point of illustration, the Frierdiker Rebbe, once released from the Russians, and there's several books authored on this topic, it was actually the International Red Cross gets involved in saving him from the Nazis, and the Nazis, obviously not willingly, but knowingly know if they harm the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it's going to be very bad for them, and work with the International Red Cross to allow the previous Rebbe passage to the United States. And the previous Rebbe sets up shop in America. When he first lands, gives his very famous, now famous speech that America is no different, with the, I was going to say undertones, but quite more accurately, overt overtones, that everything that we did as Jews in Europe, in terms of the sanctity of Shabbos, in terms of the kashrus, in terms of education for the children, should be no different in America. Now, what does that mean? The Frierdiker Rebbe comes to America, and there's a dearth of Jewish education. There's not really a kashrus organization as we know it today. There's no Agudas Yisrael running schools. There's no Torah Masorah educators conferences. There's no Agudas Harabanim of people getting together. That was something of Europe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, with several Chassidim and others, there were other Askanim already here in America, they effectively start working in all branches, and they're all kind of coming up together to create kashrus and ability to keep Shabbos and have a parnasa and all of these things simultaneously. And we see certain customs of the Chassidim. We see certain customs of the Chassidim that they would maintain, that they brought to America and would maintain. Things like glatt kosher, right? It was something that was basically a foreign concept in America at the time. People were happy if they could get kosher food at all, kosher meat in particular. And we have to look at who were the Jews coming to America prior to World War II. Not exclusively, but by and large, many of the Jews coming prior to World War II were in seek of the Golden Medina, in seek of the streets paved with gold and money falling from the sky. And they wanted to be rich. And Torah observance for some was, and for some wasn't, the biggest priority. And as you have the Frierdiker Rebbe and a certain influx of Hasidim now coming, that changes. So all of a sudden, the proliferation of kosher markets open up, the proliferation of Jewish schools, although in the early years that was very difficult, but you had the Talmud Torahs that would be housed in synagogues. Kids would go to public schools, and then from public school in the afternoons would go to malamdim, to teachers, private tutors, effectively what we would call today Hebrew school, on a daily basis. And thank God, through the work of those original people that came, we have the beautiful schools in Cleveland and all over the world that we know today to provide our children with Jewish Torah education. So there's something else that happens radically with the Jews coming over. Sorry. Let me go back for a quick second on how the Hasidim in particular settle where they settle. So the Frierdiker Rebbe comes to America. The previous Rebbe comes to America. He's not a well man. He's quite literally had been beaten and battered by the Russians. He survives, terrible torture. And his assistants, his gabayim, his secretaries implore him to take the easy life, retire. And they find he's in the Greystone Hotel in Manhattan, and they find a nice palatial place for the previous Rebbe to seek respite and relax and I guess ride out his final years. And it was a place which today is a bastion of Judaism. Then it was rolling green pastures, and it's a place called Lakewood, New Jersey. And they offered that the previous, this is before Aaron Cutler goes there and establishes the Lakewood Yeshiva. And he says he'll go for a short time, for a few weeks, to gain some strength. And in that time, the gabayim, his secretaries, his assistants need to find him a place to set up shop. And he gives them some parameters. One of those parameters is find basically an upwardly mobile Jewish community, a wealthy Jewish community that we can establish ourselves near, and we can have an impact on them. So if any of you have been to Crown Heights, Brooklyn, used to be called the suburbs, and and it was beautiful homes, and still are beautiful homes in certain parts, but it was the real suburbs, and many wealthy Jewish people lived there, and you had already the conservative and reform Jewry had already made its way to America, and the largest conservative synagogue in the New York area had a place called the Brooklyn Jewish Center on Eastern Parkway. And slightly diagonal from that was a brownstone for sale with the street address, which is now famous to many of us, of 770 Eastern Parkway. And we won't get into the details of the story of how the house is purchased, but the house is purchased and turned into the previous Rebbe's home and synagogue and the headquarters of Chabad Lubavitch, now world headquarters of Chabad Lubavitch, and it was a relatively small brownstone. It's nothing like what we know today. And from there, once the previous Rebbe had established himself in Brooklyn, as these other Rebbes are coming out from Europe primarily after the war, they settle where there already was established Jewish life, primarily established by the previous Rebbe. So they start moving to Crown Heights. So you have other Rebbes, like the Bobover Rebbe, for example, was not too far down the road. The main Bobover base medrash, the main Bobover synagogue and study hall, was just down the block or a couple blocks down from 770, as well as many other smaller Hasidic groups created themselves in Crown Heights. Crown Heights in those days was akin to Borough Park today, kind of the cholent, the melting pot of the Jewish world. So you have the Hasidim, the non-Hasidim are all living together, and your whatever you want to call them, your modern Orthodox and other Jewish groups there as well. Like I mentioned, the conservative synagogue. In the 50s, you have the white flight out of Brooklyn, where the wealthy had the ability to move in particular. And you have the group that goes out to Westchester and Long Island. And then you have your other Hasidic groups and other religious groups that move to Borough Park. That's how Borough Park really becomes Borough Park. Then it was nothing really in the early years. And Chabad stays. The Rebbe, our Rebbe was already a Rebbe, and he said, "Listen, we were here, and we're happy to share the neighborhood, but we're not going anywhere either." And this is what creates Crown Heights as this hub of specifically Chabad Chassidim. And the Friedman family was there, and in Crown Heights when it was still in the early years, and the big mix there with your grandfather, if I remember correctly. You can speak to that later, Rabbi Shmuel, if you wish. But this is what's going on. And the Frierdiker Rebbe and then the Rebbe have a huge footprint on the Hasidic world. And where they get involved with Hatzalas Nefashos, with rescuing people out of the Holocaust, where funds are being sent, how infrastructures are being built. OK Kashrus starts in the early years and is facilitated until today by Chabad Chassidim and with the bracha of the Rebbe. And these types of things totally change. Now I'm going to push pause on that because I brought us very modern. I want to talk about a few of the innovations that Chassidus brought. So I mentioned one about the yeshiva. And I touched on prayer, but I want to go a little bit deeper with davening. So I mentioned in general, like these Karliners, and there's a very emotional element. In the times of the Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon, in the early years of Chassidus, if you would have walked into the Gra, the Vilna Gaon shul, on Friday night, and there would be people singing and dancing around the bima after Lecha Dodi, to my understanding, you probably would be escorted out of the shul. It was not done. It would be considered a gross violation of decorum of the synagogue. Obviously, the Vilna Gaon was the seat of the misnagdim, of the opponents of the Chassidim in its time, and there were certain elements that they really took umbrage to, and would not allow in their communities. One of which is this singing and dancing and this visible, ecstatic expression during tefillah, during prayer. Now, today, in the year 2020. When we all got well and can get back to our shuls, you cannot go into a shul that does not have singing of Lecha Dodi and dancing of some sort on Friday night with Lecha Dodi. It's almost equally as heretical not to sing and dance by Lecha Dodi as it would have been in the Vilna Gaon shul to sing and dance, right? Might be a little bit of hyperbole on my end, but it is a true statement. Singing by Lecha Dodi is a far and widespread custom that is done the Jewish world over, and prayer in general. And you see how many of the nigunim have permeated not only Chabad nigunim but have permeated the entire Jewish sphere. Every Israeli soldier knows every Chabad nigun in the book because of the Hasidim visiting the soldiers on army bases and singing the songs, and then when they travel to Thailand and wherever else they end up, they're exposed to these nigunim, and it's which takes those songs and puts them deep into Jewish culture today, right? And even fascinatingly, and Rabbi Friedman can speak to this more than I am because he's more of a music expert, but tunes that are known by everybody, like Dayenu, were originally Lubavitcher nigunim. They came out of the Hasidim, and again are now known far and wide. And in order to have an inspiring service at any synagogue, they add nigunim, and they have a kumzitz, and this was something that was foreign to the non-Hasidic world in its origins. It was a very, very different approach. And you see philosophy obviously you have Jewish philosophy from Rabbeinu Bachaya and in things like Chavos Levavos, and you have many, many other philosophical texts, but it being condensed into a category that we'll call Hasidic philosophy. And as I'm going to move us again hyper modern for a moment, we see this evolution where the lines have become so blurred that it's almost difficult in certain areas to define something as Hasidic or non-Hasidic, right? And that's true both ways. So the certain elements of learning that was unique to the non-Hasidic yeshivas and movements have bled deep into the Hasidic world. And like the idea of learning in kollel was foreign to most of the Hasidic world up until fairly recently. And that's by way of culture and affluence, and relative affluence at least, and the proximity of everybody living so close to each other has impacted those things. And then other elements of joy, and again, it's not that the Chassidim had a monopoly on joy. I believe that there were very happy non-Chassidim that lived throughout history as well. But as a pillar of the theology and the philosophy of the movement has now moved everywhere. And now there's a term that gets used called neo-Chassidus. New Hasidus, which we don't need to discuss or debate whether it's a good term or a bad term, but it's a term that's used at the very least. And they are bringing in, meaning you cannot walk into a Jewish home, a religious Jewish home. You will always find Sifrei Hasidus on the bookshelf, whether it's a commentary on Pirkei Avos from Rabbi Nachman, or a Lekutei Moharan, which is a compilation of stories and teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Tanya, is a cornerstone text on most people's bookshelves today, Likutei Sichos, and as a point of fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the single most published Jewish scholar, and to date in Jewish history. There are more books and more publications of the Rebbe's teachings than any other single Jewish scholar in history. And again, that's a factor of how much the Rebbe taught. It's a factor of accessibility to print, and the proliferation of Chabad Chassidus throughout the world. So we see what we call Judaism today is profoundly and deeply impacted by the innovations and the evolution of the Baal Shem Tov, and how he brought the world to a totally new place by reawakening the soul vis-a-vis Kabbalah and mysticism, and by bringing in the spirit of joy and this democratization of Hashem, of God, that every Jew has a fundamental right and need and requirement to connect with the divine. And I think we're all privileged to be products of the evolution of the Baal Shem Tov, and be able to carry on the traditions and bring into our homes and our families, and especially at this time where we're a little bit more in our homes and a lot more with our families, and we go into Pesach. I would really encourage all of us to go deep into the Chassidic teachings of the Seder. And as we maybe have a little bit more time throughout the week, by the Sedarim themselves, by the Seders, and through the week of Pesach, to bring some of that light of Chassidus and that joy of Chassidus into our homes, and be able to elevate all of the generations of Chassidim and Rebbes all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov that came before us. So I'll open it up if there are some thoughts or questions. I usually end my classes here on campus with, questions, comments, or alternative speeches. Nobody's ever taken me up on the alternative speeches, but I don't know some of you, so I'm a little bit worried that I might get an alternative speech. But nonetheless, comments, questions, or alternative speeches are certainly welcome.
Thank you for the share. Do you have a suggestion on what to read for the Seder?
From the Seder
perspective, yeah.
Sure. There's two Haggadahs that I would point you to. One is the Gutnick Haggadah, which looks like a basketball. Yeah, there, that one. And it does a beautiful job. The translations are fantastic. They include a lot of customs and a lot of explanations for these customs, and shines a lot of light. The other is called in English From a Rebbe's Seder Table, which
that would have.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Highly recommend both of those.
What was the other one?
The Gutnick Haggadah.
Gutnick what?
Our Rebbe's Seder Table, or our Rebbe's Haggadah. Do you remember what it's called, Rebbe Friedman?
From the Rebbe Seder Table.
Yeah, from the Rebbe Seder Table. I have it here. I'll have to pull it off my shelves, but we're actually in the process.
Rebbe Seder Table.
So most of my books are in boxes at the moment, but I do have my Pesach ones out, and I'll send it to Rabbi Friedman to send the word out to everybody.
Yeah, both of them.
If there's any other questions or comments, happy to entertain them.
Ask your question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Will you be having classes during Pesach?
Who's the we? Me personally, or the Waxman Chabad Center?
That I'm pretty sure you will. I don't know, either one.
I don't know. I guess Rabbi Friedman and I haven't gotten past tonight yet.
Okay.
I can tell you I do offer classes throughout the week for our Chabad house, and if people want to jump on, you can. I guess I'll shamelessly plug myself, if that's okay. Just you can visit virtualchabad.com, and there's a schedule of classes offered through the Chabad website.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Well, that was an easy question, I think. But great. I want to wish you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a Freilichen Pesach, that you all should have a happy and a kosher Pesach, and that it should really be a meaningful one. And I think this will be the first Pesach ever for myself that I'll just be with my family at the Seder table. We normally spend first night Seder with about 180 of our closest friends and family at the Chabad house. And second night is about half of that. So my children are very excited. And we've also been learning from the Rebbe's Haggadah to be able to share by the Seder table. And I hope when this whole parasha, this whole thing is over, we'll all be able to get back together, uplifted, and retroactively this year should be in the merit of all of those that need a refuah, a healing, especially physically and especially from this virus. So,
Amen.
great.